On a fog-soaked Halloween night in the small, unassuming town of Silver Hill, a group of teens gathered around a fire pit, hoping for harmless frights and the thrill of a ghost story. But this night would become one of the most terrifying memories they would ever endure. For in this town, October 31st had a dark history, a history that no one dared to speak of. The legend began with a name, Ruth Millard, a woman who lived on the edge of town in the late 1800s. Ruth had once been Silver Hill's most beloved teacher, known for her kindness and a rare gift for storytelling. But one October evening, a child vanished from her care. The townsfolk had been suspicious, some claiming she had an unnatural charm about her. Rumors brewed that she practiced dark magic, that she was involved in dark arts, and that the little boy's disappearance was just the beginning. Within days, Ruth was accused, convicted, and lynched by an angry mob without trial on the barren, cursed grounds of Thornhill Forest. In the years that followed, many whispered of a shadow woman seen wandering Thornhill's edge every Halloween. Some said she was searching for the boy she never killed. Others believed she was calling for vengeance against the town that had condemned her. The stories varied, but one thing remained constant. Anyone who saw Ruth's ghostly figure on Halloween would suffer a gruesome fate by dawn. Most people brushed it off as myth, but everyone kept their distance from the forest once October 31st came. This particular Halloween, the group of friends sitting around the fire, Logan, Sarah, Kai, and Jess, did not know the legend in its entirety. They had heard whispers, but being typical teens, they laughed off the warnings, especially Kai, who prided himself on his bravery. Jess, however, felt uneasy. She could have sworn she saw movement just beyond the firelight's reach, but each time she blinked, the shadows remained still. "Let's go to the forest," Kai said with a smirk. "I mean, what's Halloween without a little scare, right?" Sarah hesitated, but eventually relented, caught up in the thrill. The four of them grabbed their flashlights and headed down the winding path toward Thornhill. The air grew colder as they approached the forest, an icy breeze slicing through them despite their warm jackets. The trees, with their knotted branches, loomed overhead like skeletal fingers reaching down to snatch them. Somewhere in the distance, they heard the eerie, rustling sounds of leaves, though no wind seemed to blow. Kai took the lead, striding confidently, flashlight swinging carelessly in his hand. Jess, bringing up the rear, couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. She kept glancing over her shoulder, heart pounding. Halfway through the forest, Sarah screamed. She'd stumbled upon an old, decrepit tree with a gnarled rope still hanging from one of its branches, a rope that appeared frayed and worn, yet ominously strong. It was the same tree from the town's ghost story, the place where Ruth was hanged. Logan looked around nervously, his face pale. Maybe we should go back, but Kai scoffed. "It's just an old rope," he said, touching it as if to prove there was nothing to fear. Yet, as his fingers brushed against it, an overwhelming sense of dread filled the air. A deathly silence fell, so absolute it drowned out the nighttime sounds. The group exchanged glances, their eyes widening in mutual horror. It was then that they realized they could no longer see the path behind them. The way back had vanished into an impenetrable wall of darkness. Suddenly, Logan's flashlight flickered and died. One by one, the others' lights followed suit, leaving them stranded in the pitch black. In the silence, a soft, almost mournful whisper began to drift through the trees. It was faint, but unmistakable, a woman's voice calling their names, one by one, each time closer than before. The friends clung to each other, paralyzed by terror as the voice grew louder, sharper, almost a shriek. And then they saw her, a shadowy figure, draped in what looked like rotting fabric, standing beneath the tree. Her head was tilted unnaturally, and her face was obscured, but they could feel her gaze, icy, seething with hatred. The figure began to move toward them, her steps slow but unrelenting. Jess broke first, screaming as she turned to run, but her foot caught on an exposed root, sending her sprawling. As she looked up, she found herself staring into Ruth's hollow, vengeful eyes. The others were too petrified to move, watching in horror as the figure leaned closer to Jess, whispering something only she could hear. Jess began to convulse, her body thrashing as if in unimaginable pain. Kai and Logan finally snapped out of their terror and tried to pull her up, but the moment their hands touched her, they felt an electric jolt, like ice-cold fire burning through their veins. They stumbled back, watching as Jess went limp, her eyes staring blankly up at the sky, her face frozen in a twisted expression of fear. The apparition let out a scream, a soul-chilling wail that echoed through the forest, shaking the trees and sending a murder of crows bursting into the sky. The boys, now frantic, dragged Sarah to her feet, and the three of them ran blindly through the darkness, branches clawing at their faces as they tried to escape the horror. The whispers persisted, weaving through the trees like a curse that clung to them. Every time they thought they had gained distance, the ghostly figure appeared, always just behind them, her hollow eyes gleaming with malice. Finally, they broke through the edge of the forest, collapsing onto the road as the first rays of dawn pierced through the fog. The police found them shortly afterward, huddled together and trembling, their faces white with terror. They had no words, just a single horrifying memory. Jess, lying under that cursed tree, her eyes staring into nothingness. Though the authorities searched for her body, they found nothing, and it was as if she had vanished entirely from existence. Jess's disappearance was ruled a tragedy, a freak accident, but the friends knew the truth. They knew that Ruth Millard's spirit had not rested in peace, and every Halloween, they live with the knowledge that she is still out there, waiting in the darkness, her whispers lingering in the corners of their nightmares. Silver Hill hasn't had a single Halloween go by without some unexplained disappearance since then. On the eve of Halloween, in a rundown, remote town called Ravenswood, the townsfolk often spoke in hushed tones about the house on Black Hill. The mansion had sat abandoned for decades, yet each year someone claimed to hear faint laughter or see lights flickering inside on Halloween night. The stories warned of the man with the wide smile, a spirit who had once lived in the house, a man with a twisted sense of humor and an insatiable hunger for company. The legend began on Halloween night, years before, with Thomas Winthrop, a wealthy recluse who bought the Black Hill Mansion in the late 1800s. Thomas was known for his unusual habits, but his smile was his most peculiar feature. A constant, unhinged grin that never wavered, not even when he spoke of disturbing things or laughed about death. People thought he was harmless until a series of disappearances started to shake the community. Young children, drifters, and visitors went missing near his mansion, but nothing ever tied back to him. Rumors spread that he had a special room, a place he called the Smiling Chamber, where he would lure his victims. And then, one Halloween night, Thomas vanished, leaving only his smile etched into the town's memory. That was decades ago, and though the house had been abandoned, the whispers and warnings persisted. No one went near it on Halloween night. But this year, 3 local teens, Owen, Lily, and Darren, decided to test the legend. They were skeptical, even eager, to prove the stories wrong. Armed with flashlights and a single bottle of whiskey for liquid courage, they made their way up Black Hill, determined to spend Halloween night inside the haunted mansion. The house loomed over them, its once grand exterior rotted and peeling. The doors groaned as they opened, almost as if the house were breathing them in. Inside, the air was damp and musty, filled with the faint smell of decay. Their flashlights scanned the walls, revealing cracked wallpaper and portraits of people with faces scratched out. Owen laughed nervously, calling out, "Where are you, Mr. Winthrop?" But the sound echoed ominously, swallowed by the dark. They wandered through empty rooms, the silence pressing in on them. Occasionally they heard soft scratching sounds, but each time they searched for the source, there was nothing there. Then they found a door leading to the basement. Lily felt a wave of dread wash over her, but Darren, always the daring one, swung the door open, leading them down the rickety steps. In the basement, they found a strange sight, an entire room filled with mannequins, each posed as though frozen mid-scream, faces twisted in horror. Dust clung to them, but beneath, the mannequins' expressions were eerily lifelike, each mouth open wide, each pair of eyes staring into something unseen. As Owen's flashlight passed over the figures, they noticed something chilling. One mannequin, positioned near the center, wore an old stained suit, and a twisted smile had been carved across its face. Darren laughed it off, calling it a prank, but Lily had an overwhelming urge to leave. She felt watched, as though the mannequins were breathing, subtly shifting when she wasn't looking. The 3 decided to leave the basement, but as they turned toward the stairs, They heard it, a soft chuckle, followed by the faintest sound of footsteps. They froze, their eyes wide as the laughter grew louder, closer. Panic surged through them, and they bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind them. But when they reached the foyer, the front door that had easily opened before was now locked. They pulled, twisted, even threw their weight against it, but it wouldn't budge. That's when the lights went out. Only the flicker of their flashlights remained, casting long, jittering shadows that danced across the room. A cold draft swept through the house, and with it came a chilling voice, echoing from somewhere in the dark. "You're not leaving so soon, are you? It's just begun." Lily screamed, and they sprinted toward the staircase, hoping to find another way out. But as they ran, the walls seemed to close in on them, shifting, contorting, the mansion itself becoming a labyrinth. The stairs stretched impossibly high, and the doors they opened led only to more twisted hallways lined with more grinning portraits. The house was alive, shifting with each step they took, each turn leading them deeper into a maze they couldn't escape. Finally, they burst into a room they hadn't seen before, a small parlor with a single flickering candle on a table in the center. And beside it, smiling broadly, was Thomas Winthrop. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, but his smile, wide, eerie, unchanging, was unmistakable. "Oh, you made it! I've been waiting," he said, his voice laced with an unsettling warmth. "It gets so lonely here, you know." The teens backed away, but as they did, the door they'd come through vanished. Thomas stepped forward, his smile widening as he opened his arms. "I always wanted company, you know," he whispered. "Friends who would never leave." Then, in one fluid motion, he lifted a bony hand, pointing it toward Darren. Before they could react, a dark shadow leaped from Thomas, slithering across the floor like smoke. It wrapped itself around Darren, tightening as he gasped and thrashed, his body contorting, limbs twisting, his face slowly stretching into a horrible, frozen smile. Owen and Lily could only watch in horror as Darren's eyes turned glassy, his skin pale. He was becoming one of them, one of the mannequins, a prisoner of the house. Within seconds, Darren's face had hardened, his mouth fixed in a silent scream. The room was now quiet, save for the echo of Thomas's laughter, filling every corner, every shadow. Desperate, Owen grabbed Lily, yanking her away from the scene, and they bolted down yet another twisting corridor, the walls whispering their names, promising they'd never escape. Just as they felt the last of their hope draining, they stumbled into an empty room. There, in the floor, was a trapdoor, barely visible beneath a dusty rug. They flung it open and threw themselves down into the darkness, not caring where it led. After crawling through a narrow tunnel, they emerged, gasping, outside the house, cold sweat drenching them. They ran without looking back, even as they heard Thomas's voice calling from the darkness, that ghastly laughter echoing long into the night. When they reached the town, people said they looked different, haunted. They tried to speak of what they had seen, but each time they mentioned the house, their mouths twisted into an involuntary smile. As the years went on, Owen and Lily never escaped the pull of Black Hill. On the following Halloween, and every Halloween after, the two were drawn back to the mansion, wandering its halls, caught between terror and a sinister, ever-widening grin. It's said that if you walk by the house on Halloween night, you can still hear faint laughter and see shadows moving in the windows. New visitors, helplessly drawn inside, joining the eternal company of the man with the wide smile. On Halloween night, in the isolated coastal village of Rockhaven, a thick fog rolled in from the sea, swallowing the town in a dense, ghostly mist. The people of Rockhaven had learned over generations to fear such fog. It only appeared on Halloween, and when it did, people vanished. Doors and windows were bolted shut, candles were lit in every room, and no one dared to venture outside. The villagers called it the soul fog, a mist believed to be filled with the spirits of lost sailors who drowned off the coast, forever searching for new souls to drag back with them. But this Halloween, 3 college friends, Mara, Liam, and Nick, came to Rockhaven, unaware of the village's dark history. They'd been drawn in by the old legends, thinking they were just stories to scare off tourists, and decided to rent a small cottage for a spooky getaway. As the fog began creeping in, Mara excitedly peered out the window, marveling at the way it cloaked the world outside in an otherworldly haze. "Come on," Mara urged, her voice hushed with thrill. "Let's go explore. It's Halloween." After all, Liam was hesitant, sensing something unsettling in the thick silence that hung around them, but Nick, the most adventurous of the three, agreed immediately. So they grabbed their flashlights and stepped into the night, unaware that they were breaking the unspoken rule the villagers never dared to break. As soon as they left the cottage, the air grew unnaturally cold. The fog swallowed their flashlights' beams, leaving only small orbs of light as they tried to navigate the twisting streets. As they wandered, they noticed something strange. Every house they passed was dark inside, with candles flickering in the windows, their weak glows swallowed by the mist. This place is like a ghost town, Nick whispered, laughing nervously. But no one laughed with him. An uneasy silence stretched between them as they moved deeper into the fog-covered village. The cold seemed to seep into their bones, and they began hearing strange sounds, soft whispers, faint shuffling footsteps that seemed to come from all directions. Then, suddenly, they saw it. A figure standing in the fog a few yards ahead, barely visible. The person wore old, tattered clothing with long, wild hair and eyes that seemed to reflect the moonlight, though there was none to be seen. Liam froze. "Hello," he called, his voice trembling. The figure didn't respond, only lifted one pale, bony finger to its lips in a shushing gesture. And then, before they could blink, it was gone, vanished back into the mist. Nick laughed uneasily, trying to brush it off, but Mara felt a shiver run down her spine. Something was very wrong. The fog seemed to grow thicker, pressing in on them as if it had a life of its own. They tried to turn back toward their cottage, but every street and alley they took seemed to lead them somewhere new, somewhere darker and unfamiliar. Mara's panic started to rise as she realized they were lost in a village that wasn't meant for them, not tonight. As they wandered desperate to find their way back, they stumbled upon the old churchyard, an eerie, desolate place surrounded by a wrought iron fence. The fog was especially thick here, swirling around ancient gravestones as if something were moving just out of sight. The gate creaked as they pushed it open and stepped inside, hoping to find some clue, something familiar. But as they entered, the gate slammed shut behind them with a finality that made their hearts race. Did you hear that?" Mara whispered, clutching Liam's arm. In the silence, they all heard it, a faint, wet dragging sound coming from somewhere deeper in the fog. It was slow and methodical, as if someone or something was pulling itself across the ground. Nick tried to rationalize, insisting it must be the wind, but his voice shook. Mara shined her flashlight around, but the fog was so dense it felt almost solid, swallowing the beam as if mocking her attempts to see. The dragging sound grew louder, closer, and then they saw him. A sailor, his uniform soaked through with seawater, his face pale and gaunt, eyes sunken. A long rope was tied around his waist, trailing off into the darkness behind him. He staggered toward them, eyes hollow and filled with a sorrowful, soul-deep emptiness. "Please," he rasped, voice barely a whisper. "Help me." The friends were paralyzed, unable to tear their gaze from the sailor's ghastly form. Then, behind him, more figures emerged from the fog, all dressed in tattered sailor uniforms, their bodies bloated and waterlogged, dragging themselves forward with vacant, pleading eyes. They reached out their hands, fingers claw-like, as if begging for someone, anyone, to take their place in the darkness. Suddenly, one of the sailors lunged at Nick, grasping his arm with an icy, vice-like grip. Nick screamed, trying to wrench himself free, but the sailor's strength was unnatural, his fingers digging into Nick's skin like cold iron. Liam and Mara grabbed Nick, pulling with all their might, and somehow managed to break him free, sending them all tumbling backward. They scrambled to their feet, running blindly through the fog, the dead sailors following them with dragging steps, calling out in desperate, haunting voices. Their whispers filled the air. "Stay! Stay with us! We're so lonely!" Panicked and breathless, they stumbled out of the churchyard, but the fog seemed alive, twisting and shifting to keep them lost within its grasp. They ran in circles, unable to find a way out, each turn leading them back to the same churchyard gates, the dead sailors waiting for them, watching with those hollow eyes. Finally, Mara noticed a dim light ahead, a flickering lantern hanging in a window of one of the houses. Desperate, they ran toward it, hoping to find someone who could help them. They pounded on the door, and an old woman opened it, her face grim and lined with sorrow. You went outside in the soul fog?" she asked, her voice trembling. She pulled them inside quickly, bolting the door and lighting more candles around the room. "They'll be back. The dead don't give up so easily. Liam tried to speak, but his voice was gone, trapped by the terror he'd just witnessed. The woman explained that the sailors of Rockhaven's coast were lost to the sea long ago, victims of a brutal storm on Halloween night. Ever since, they roamed the fog, searching for others to drag into the ocean's depths, hoping to find peace. But we didn't. We didn't do anything wrong, Nick stammered, his voice filled with desperation. The woman's eyes were filled with sorrow. They don't care. They want to be free from the ocean's grasp, and only a living soul can take their place. The night stretched on as the friends huddled together, too terrified to even close their eyes. Just before dawn, the fog began to lift, and the woman finally allowed them to leave, urging them never to return. They returned home, but they could never shake the feeling that the sailors were still watching them, waiting. Every Halloween night that followed, each of them heard the soft whispers of the dead, felt the chill of cold, watery hands reaching for them from the shadows. And when the fog rolled in, no matter where they were, they'd find them standing at their doors, staring into the mist, feeling that pull, that terrible, inescapable call from Rockhaven's lost souls. In the quiet village of Brookfall, there stood an old, weather-beaten tree in the center of the town cemetery. Its twisted branches and gnarled trunk seemed to stretch out like grasping arms. And every Halloween, the townspeople would see strange things near that tree, a flicker of movement, soft whispers drifting through the air, and sometimes figures standing beneath its boughs at night. The tree had a name, passed down through generations: the Devil's Tree. The legend went that over a century ago, a woman named Eliza Marrow had been accused of witchcraft. Brookfall was a deeply superstitious town, and her misfortune was to be blamed for a terrible famine and a sickness that had spread like wildfire through the village. In their fear, the villagers turned on her, condemning her as a witch who had summoned misfortune to Brookfall. They dragged her to the cemetery, tied her to the tree, and left her to die under the full moon. But as she was abandoned to her fate, she placed a curse on the town. Each Halloween she would rise, taking someone back with her to the shadowy realm where she now resided. Most people brushed off the story as old superstition, a spooky tale to tell children around the fire. But strange things did happen. Each Halloween, someone from the village would disappear without a trace. Sometimes a young man, other times an old woman, occasionally even a child. The townspeople grew wary of the Devil's Tree and did everything they could to avoid it. But one Halloween night, 3 adventurous teens, Emmett, Holly, and Jonah, decided to put the legend to the test. They snuck out under the cover of darkness, fueled by a dare and a few shots of whiskey they'd stolen from Emmett's dad. They trekked through the cemetery, their flashlights casting thin beams of light through the misty night. The air was colder than it should have been, and as they neared the Devil's Tree, the mist thickened, clinging to the ground like a ghostly shroud. "I don't know. Maybe we shouldn't be here," Holly whispered, her voice shaky as she glanced at the twisted branches overhead. But Emmett laughed it off. "Come on, it's just a tree. We're going to spend 10 minutes here, and then we'll have a great story to tell." They gathered at the base of the Devil's Tree, looking up at the warped branches. Jonah reached out to touch the bark, but his hand recoiled almost immediately. "It's freezing," he muttered, rubbing his palm. The temperature dropped suddenly, and all around them the night grew deathly silent. Then they heard it, a faint whisper drifting through the air, soft but unmistakable. The voice was that of a woman, and though they couldn't make out the words, it sounded mournful, like a cry from somewhere deep, dark, and far away. Holly shivered, her fear spiking as the whispers grew louder and more distinct. "Why have you come?" the voice asked, louder now, like a hiss that wound its way around them. Emmett chuckled, trying to play it cool. "We're just here to see if you're real," he said to the air, mockingly, trying to hide the tremor in his voice. The tree's branches rustled, though there was no breeze, and the whispers turned into something more like a growl. "Then you will stay." As the words filled the air, they felt a sickening, bone-deep chill. Holly gasped as she saw something moving at the edge of her vision. Turning, she saw shadowy figures emerging from the mist. Dozens of them, all with blank, empty faces. Each one had hollow, black eyes, and as they drifted closer, she realized that their mouths were frozen open in silent screams. "Run!" Jonah screamed, grabbing Holly's hand and pulling her away from the tree. Emmett hesitated, but only for a second before he turned and sprinted after them, the figures growing closer with each step. The trio ran through the cemetery, stumbling over gravestones, the chilling sound of the whispers filling the air, growing louder and angrier with every step they took. They reached the cemetery gates, but as they looked back, they could see the figures still moving toward them, vanishing into the mist only to reappear closer. They sprinted back to Holly's house, slamming the door shut behind them, panting and terrified. They locked every door, pulled down every blind, and huddled together in Holly's room, the adrenaline slowly draining away as silence settled around them. But deep down, they felt something wasn't right. They'd escaped, but a sense of foreboding hung in the air. An hour later, the clock struck midnight, marking the end of Halloween. Just as they began to relax, they heard a soft scratching at the window. It was faint, but unmistakable. Holly's heart skipped a beat. She looked at Emmett and Jonah, her face pale, and then reluctantly approached the window. Outside, there was nothing, just the thick fog drifting through the street. She sighed in relief, but as she stepped back, a sharp knock echoed from the front door. They froze, staring at each other, the knock repeating, louder, insistent. Holly clutched Emmett's arm, her voice a trembling whisper. No one would be outside. It's the middle of the night. But the knocking continued, and then it turned into pounding, as if someone or something was trying to break through the door. Finally, they crept downstairs, each step slower than the last, the sounds reverberating through the empty house. When they reached the door, the pounding suddenly stopped. In the silence, they could hear their own breaths, shallow and panicked. Emmett gathered his courage and slowly reached for the doorknob, opening the door just a crack. The mist outside seemed to hang like a solid wall, dense and impenetrable, and then, without warning, a hand shot through the gap, grasping his wrist with a grip like ice. Emmett screamed as he felt the fingers digging into his skin, pulling him forward. The others grabbed onto him, trying to pull him back, but the hand was unyielding, dragging him closer, inch by inch. Emmett's face contorted in terror as he stared into the mist, where a figure with hollow eyes and an open, screaming mouth stared back at him, its grip tightening. Holly and Jonah pulled with all their strength, managing to break him free just as the figure in the mist let out a low, spine-chilling moan. They slammed the door shut, but Emmett's face was white, his wrist bruised and ice-cold. He looked at them, his eyes wide with horror. She said, "We'll never leave, that she's marked us." For the rest of the night, they huddled together, every creak of the house and every gust of wind sending fresh waves of terror through them. And though the morning came, none of them could shake the feeling of being watched. In the days that followed, Emmett began to change. His laughter grew hollow, and his smile twisted into something unnaturally wide, his eyes slowly losing their warmth. Holly and Jonah tried to reach out to him, but he would only stare at them, his mouth stretched into an unnatural, silent scream. Then, just a week after Halloween, Emmett vanished, leaving no trace behind. Months later, Holly and Jonah returned to the cemetery on a cold, gray evening, hoping to find closure. And there, beneath the twisted branches of the devil's tree, they found a new face in the bark, a twisted, tormented face, forever frozen in a scream, its hollow eyes staring out, watching, waiting for the next soul brave enough, or foolish enough, to test the legend of the devil's tree. In the small, quiet town of Black Hollow, there was a legend about a deserted house on the edge of town that everyone avoided, especially on Halloween. It was a grand old mansion that had fallen into ruin, its paint peeling and windows shattered, but it was the tale of the man in the walls that kept people away. The story went that anyone who entered the house after dark would hear him whispering through the walls, sometimes scratching, other times calling their names. Those who ignored the warnings and stayed inside never came out again. One Halloween, 4 friends, Evan, Lily, Tom, and Rachel, decided to test their courage by spending the night in the old mansion. They laughed off the warnings from townsfolk, considering it just another ghost story. So, armed with flashlights and snacks, they made their way to the house as darkness fell. As they entered, the house felt colder than it should have been, and their footsteps echoed unnaturally through the long hallways. The air was thick, almost oppressive, and a faint, musty smell filled their noses. They found a room on the second floor to set up camp, laying out sleeping bags and lighting a few candles, trying to create a sense of warmth in the eerie, empty house. But as they settled in, an odd scratching sound started coming from the walls, faint at first, then growing louder, as if something or someone was clawing from the other side. The noise seemed to travel, moving from one corner of the room to another, making their skin crawl. "Probably just rats," Evan said, trying to keep his voice steady. But the scratching wasn't random. It was rhythmic, almost purposeful, like fingers dragging slowly down the wooden walls. Then it stopped, and in the silence that followed, they heard a soft voice, barely above a whisper, speaking from the wall just behind them. "Who is here?" Rachel gasped, clutching Tom's arm. Did you all hear that?" They nodded, their faces pale, but no one dared to move. The silence pressed in, and then the voice came again, closer, louder. "Why did you come here?" it asked, the words thick with anger. "Let's get out of here," Lily whispered, her voice trembling, and they all agreed. But as they stood to leave, the door slammed shut on its own, the sound echoing through the empty mansion. They rushed to the door, pulling and pounding, but it wouldn't budge, as if some invisible force held it shut. Panic set in, and the whispers began again, more voices joining in, overlapping, creating a nightmarish chorus from all around them. The whispers grew louder and faster, and then they heard it, a slow, heavy scraping sound, like something large being dragged across the floor from the hallway outside their room. Evan, his hand trembling, pressed his ear to the door, hoping to catch a hint of what was on the other side. The sound stopped for a moment, and then, right next to his ear, he heard a wet, rattling breath, followed by a voice. "Let me in." He stumbled back, his face drained of color, as they all stared in horror at the door. Shadows began to seep from the edges, sliding down the walls like oily tendrils, and the room filled with an intense chill that made their breaths visible in the air. The walls around them seemed to pulse, almost as if they were breathing, and then they saw it, a face pushing through the wallpaper, stretching and contorting as if trying to break free. Lily screamed, and the face twisted, its mouth opening in a soundless scream, pressing harder against the wall, its eyes wild and desperate. The other walls began to bulge as well, more faces appearing, each one trapped, each one writhing and pressing forward. Some were expressionless, others frozen in terror, and some seemed to stare directly at them with pleading eyes. Rachel began to sob, clawing at the locked door, desperate to escape, while Evan and Tom tried to break it down. But their attempts were useless, and the faces in the walls seemed to grow more frantic, stretching and clawing to escape. Suddenly, one of the faces, the first one they'd seen, began to speak, its voice a guttural rasp. "I was here first, they took me." The others joined in, voices layering on top of each other in agonized, distorted cries. "They took us all. They took us all." Lily collapsed to the floor, covering her ears, her face pale as she whispered, "Who are they?" The answer came in a low, hissing chorus. The house takes us all." The walls began to shake, cracks forming and spreading across the room as if the house itself was coming alive. The faces in the walls seemed to laugh and scream all at once, the noise filling the room with a cacophony of despair. Then, as if in answer to some unseen signal, the scratching returned, louder, more frantic. It was as though the house was tearing itself apart, and the friends clung to each other in sheer terror. Just as they thought they would be buried alive in the collapsing room, the door flew open. Without a second thought, they bolted, sprinting down the long, twisting halls, the walls around them pulsing and shifting, like the house itself was trying to trap them inside. The voices followed them, echoing through every corridor, whispering their names, begging them to stay. They burst through the front door, stumbling into the cold night, gasping for air as they collapsed on the overgrown lawn. When they looked back at the mansion, it was silent and still, the windows empty and dark as if it had never come alive at all. They didn't speak as they made their way back to town, each one feeling a lingering, heavy presence, as though invisible eyes were watching them from the shadows. And over the following days, strange things began to happen to each of them. At night, they would hear the soft scratching at their bedroom walls. They'd wake up to faint whispers calling their names, voices that only they could hear. One by one, they each began to change. Evan became distant, his once bright personality dulling into something quiet and cold. Tom started sleepwalking, always wandering toward the outskirts of town, muttering in his sleep about the house. Rachel withdrew from everyone, staring at the walls of her room as if she could see faces in them. Then, one by one, they disappeared. Each Halloween, another one vanished, leaving nothing but a whisper in the walls of their empty homes. Years later, the townsfolk say that if you dare to enter the old mansion on Halloween night, you'll still hear them scratching and whispering, trapped within the walls, just like those before them. And if you listen closely, you might hear the house's quiet, hungry voice, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to enter its doors.